So today's talk is about ITDR. We're gonna go in depth what ITDR really means, but before we do that, quick introduction. My name is Sam van Hof. I'm a business development manager at Exclusive Networks. I've been here for over 6 years now. I come from a technical background, so I was part of the pre-sales team, but now I'm in the sales team. And together with Davey, we're part of the new tech team. I've got different vendors in portfolio, so main focus is on Sulfort, SentinelOne, Netscope, Simulate, and Axonius. And Sulfort and SentinelOne will also be present here today. At least we're gonna tell something about them.
Hey, good morning, everybody. So my name is Davey. As I mentioned, I'm part of we're part of together the new technology team. I'm a senior cybersecurity consultant, and most of my time goes to new technologies, basically in endpoint identity and cloud security. So it also means that the vendors I'm responsible for, from a technical perspective, are indeed Silverfort, SentinelOne, Vectra, Netscope, Simulate. I just love to do technical stuff, diving into new technologies. And that's also the reason why we're here today, is to talk about a new upcoming or already very active technology today, which is identity security.
So why do we do this session? Well, we're going to explain the concept ITDR, but also because we saw a lot of these type of attacks last year. If you look at all those social engineering attacks, they are happening more and more. Why? Because first of all, it's easier for them. Why develop 0 days and difficult malware? We can just use social engineering. So we see this, they do this more and more, because if you don't use malware, it's difficult to be detected. You don't need any EDR tool because they will detect malware, so you're not going to use it. And that's a problem. So if they use valid credentials to gain access, and they're going to infiltrate your network, they're going to deploy ransomware, and it's only being noticed when it's too late. EDRs are great, but you can't help or prevent you to detect these type of identity attacks. If you look at this example of these casinos, they were breached in the same way, and it was all by getting access by social engineering. They removed those attackers using credentials that were leaked from a previous breach, hoping that a lot of people still do password reuse. And so they had the credentials, and then they just called the help desk and they did phishing. So they called them and they actually convinced the help desk employee to reset the MFA token. And we see APTs are using that more and more often. Lapsus is one of those APTs that's actually breached a lot of big tech companies, even security companies, just by using social engineering. And why? Because again, they're not using malware. A lot of those companies have a lot of tools deployed for detecting malware. But if you just say online, okay, who's got credentials for us? We're willing to pay for them. It's difficult to detect in that way. So again, our identity is crucial here. We don't have a perimeter anymore. That's why over 50% of all data breaches are happening in the cloud. And attackers can migrate from on cloud to on-prem and the other way around. Our identity is traveling in this hybrid environment, and it's crucial to protect, because it will get worse before it gonna get better. And it's changing the real game also for defenders. Why? Because those APTs are getting so good in what they do in getting that initial access. They just shifted their focus. They are now specializing in that initial access, and they sell that on the dark web. So those initial access brokers are really stirring up the place, because they're gonna get access, and they could use exploits. But why use exploits if you can just use social engineering to get that initial feed on the street or at the customer, and that way they can just sell that to the highest bidder. And if you look at this comes from Manning's report of 2023, our initial attack vectors here. If you look at phishing, solo credentials, prior compromise is a big part, and it's all based on identity. Getting someone to lure them to get those credentials, to lure them to execute some tools. And in that way, when attackers also come into an environment, they need to do some more with that, because they want to get to a goal. They want to go lateral in an environment. It could be on the cloud or on-prem, but they have to have credentials for that. They could use an admin account. They could use a machine account. But again, it's all about identity. So because make no mistake, you will get breached. At some point, every one of us will get breached. The question is, what will be the impact? Will you get up again because you took your right precautions, or are you staying down because they crippled your environment? Those precautions are part of the Zero Trust Maturity Model. The Zero Trust Maturity Model comes from CISA, and it's a very good way to start. This paper goes into detail what steps you need to take on the 5 different pillars to make sure you minimize the impact of a breach, because that's the whole idea. You're gonna get breached, we all know that. Minimize that impact, but it's a long journey, because you see the 5 different pillars here are focused today on identity. But if you look at those 5 different pillars, it's a journey to implement it. It will take time and a lot of effort, and you can see there are different stages in that journey. uh, at least from an identity point of view, most companies are already in the initial phase because they have some MFA and they do some manual risk assessment. But in the end, the optimal goal is to have continuous validation. Make sure it's phishing resistant. We will show you, or at least tell you about some other stuff like MFA bombing or bypass MFA. So we need to make sure we can be resistant for that. But also an automated risk assessment over those multiple IDPs. Get a whole picture of it, because you want to grant access on a tailor needed base. And it can only be if you look at all the pillars and have that context for a complete situational awareness.
All right, so how do we approach this identity pillar, and how do we approach identity security in general? Well, that's of course the topic of this talk today. It's about ITDR, or the securing your identity, and making sure you have identity security products in place where needed. So a little bit of history maybe to start with about ITDR itself, or the term. It actually came from Gartner, who released a trends report last year in 2022, where they focused on 7 key trends that they saw, the top 7 trends that they saw in the market and adversaries, from adversary behavior. And identity was on number 2. So they noticed that there was a serious increase in the last years in adversaries or attackers targeting our IAM infrastructure, or basically our identity infrastructure, using identity attacks. And in order to have a sort of a frame to talk about all these types of attacks and the way we can approach or defend against them, they brought a new term on the market called Identity Threat Detection and Response, or ITDR. They also said it's not a solution that is in one package. It's a set of tools and best practices that you actually need in order to defend against identity-based attacks. Now, what these tools and best practices should bring to you is a few capabilities. So first of all, they need to add or have capability of discovering and inspecting every type of authentication and access request going on in an environment. It needs to have capability of analyzing them and provide you the option of enforcing certain policies. For example, if we go back to the zero trust maturity model that Stan mentioned, one of these things is that you need to have a per access request basis. So really enforcing access only, or validating access only when it's really needed and when the user really needs that access. So policies are your way of enforcing that. Now, when we're looking at identity-based attacks, you need a way of, first of all, indeed, like identifying that it happened. And once you notice that there's an identity security incident, you need to have incident management and remediation options. How do you recover from an identity-based attack? Do you need to recover your Active Directory environment, for example? How do you fix everything that is broken and turn it back to the way it was before the attack happened? This is part of what the incident management and remediation options of these tool sets should offer you. Now, there's no good talk without ChatGPT these days, so we asked ChatGPT what ITDR is and explain it to us in 2 sentences. We had to help it a bit, got a bit confused about disaster recovery, which is not the topic of today. But it says, okay, identity threat detection response, and it gave us a pretty nice definition, I must say, in 2 lines. So what it said is that, or what it gave back as feedback, is that ITDR is about monitoring and safeguarding against unauthorized access or any malicious activity related to users, right? So user authentication, access to certain resources, files, you name it, whatever you're using in order to do your day-to-day work, what your business is operating on, that's what you want to monitor, that's what you want to guard against. What does that mean? It means that you are real-time looking in those authentications, for example, in what the user is doing, in the user behavior, and responding to it very rapidly and preferably automatically on these identity-related security threats. So 2 sentences which should actually summarize pretty good what ITDR is really about. Now, looking at the Gartner hype cycle, it will be no surprise to you that ITDR is still in the innovation phase, although it's really close already going to the top of the hype cycle. This means that if you were looking at technologies today, that you will see vendors who are doing ITDR and have a clear vision, and we'll show you a few examples at the end of the talk. But you also notice that other ones are still looking their way, like how are we going to approach this ITDR thing? How are we going to secure identity? And some of them have already good directions, and you will notice that other ones are sort of taking it with it just in order to cover it, but they don't really cover it fully. Right? It's not, for example, because you're taking in identity logs, let's say, or user authentication logs that you're doing ITDR. It is a small part of it. So just be aware that we're still in the innovation phase. We're still finding our way, filling in the gaps, see what it's really about. And a few vendors or a few solutions on the market already have a better vision and a clear vision. And sort of on this graph would be further on the line already. So when we're thinking ITDR, and we have a little quiz here. Stan, what are we thinking about?
Passwords.
Correct. This is 2 times the top 10 list of passwords seen in cybersecurity breaches. Now, one of them is from this year, the other one is 10 years old. Have a little guess. Which one is the oldest?
Well, they're both terrible, but I will guess the left one.
Correct, but they are indeed both terrible. And it means something. What we see here is that there's actually, in more than a decade, there hasn't been a real big difference in passwords being seen in security breaches. These top 10 lists almost look the same. And of course, it's a bit biased to say that users haven't learned anything because these come from security breaches, but it gives you an idea that we're still using, unfortunately, this old classic way of passwords, and we actually should stop putting the responsibility of user authentication and the security of that with passwords at the end user. We cannot put this in the hands of the end user and hoping that he will choose complex passwords and making great combinations that can be hacked. That's not the reality. And we try to enforce it using MFA and password managers, hardware software tokens, and the adoption is great. Sometimes the user finds it a bit difficult, but more and more we see great adoption of these technologies. But of course, they don't solve the password problem yet. And we've seen that in the last 13 years, we can still see same passwords being used. Now, luckily, recently we've seen a big evolution towards passwordless, where we no longer need to remember these passwords and these complex passwords and rotate them every now and then. But now we go for an approach where we sort of own the secrets on our devices that we have. So on our mobiles, on our laptop, etc. Even in our accounts, for example, in our iCloud account for Apple. And we see the big tech giants, so Apple, Google, but also Okta, and I recently saw it as well as on GitHub, for example, when I wanted to log in, that it's briefly asking me like, do you want to log in with a passwordless approach with your key, etc. So passwordless is about owning the secrets on your devices. You unlock it with biometrics, for example, with your fingerprint, you unlock your phone, and then you allow the authentication to happen. You don't need to fill in any password anymore. It just goes automatically. And it's also a public-private key cryptography mechanism. So you don't send actually a secret to the server, but you do a authentication mechanism using the WebAuth protocol. All these companies that are in there are also part of the FIDO alliances, the FIDO alliance, and it's one of them that is really pushing this technology, also with FIDO keys, for example. Now, does this solve identity security in general? Well, no. It solves the password problem. And this is an interesting quote from spycloud.com, which says that it's great, but we should not be immune to the fact that it doesn't solve all our cybersecurity issues, and especially identity security. It is a must to go for passwordless, but there are other ways that hackers will try to get beyond this and bypass this. For example, session hijacking. You don't need any credentials, you don't need any MFA bypass capabilities in order to steal session tokens. I think the best example that we recently saw was the Okta breach, where session tokens from customers were actually stolen through HAR files from the support system of Okta. And these session tokens give you a perfect valid way in to different systems because you have a valid session token present. You can present it to the system and you're allowed access, even though you didn't need to enter any credentials or you didn't even need any MFA bypass techniques or whatever. So yes, passwordless is solving the password problem, and it's a good adoption, and I hope it goes fast and that we all next year we don't talk anymore about passwords, but there are still other techniques that adversaries are using, of course, and that's why identity security is still very important. So back to Gartner, where do they focus ITDR? Well, ITDR, like I said, it's about detection and response, right? It's identity threat detection and response. So it means it lays in between your identity infrastructure, managing your users, your groups, etc., and also on top, or let's say in between your security and operations infrastructure. So your EDR, MDR, your SIM tool, etc. You basically get all the information from your identity infrastructure, from your network on who's authenticating to what service, and you're sharing, you're looking at it, and you're trying to respond to that identity behavior or those identity threats and sharing that with your security stack. What are we looking for? We're looking for specific identity-based threats, and that can be classic things like password spraying, brute forcing, but also more complex ones, right? Like Kerberos attacks, like the golden ticket attack or silver ticket attack. Everything related to privilege escalation, lateral movement. And we'll see examples of lateral movement, for example, even on-prem hybrid. So all these kinds of attacks are focused on identity attacks, and you know we're a fan of the MITRE ATT&CK framework, but these are the ones you will also find in the framework using on the different tactics and techniques in there. I think it's fair to say that if we're looking at our IAM infrastructure, we're almost always talking Active Directory, maybe with some examples here and there, but most of us are, or most of our customers are also standardized on Active Directory with an extension these days to Azure AD, or we must say Entra ID since the renaming a few months ago. Now, Active Directory has a lot of vulnerabilities, a lot of exploits, design flaws, attack paths being discovered. And for example, this is a talk from Black Hat 2014, where Benjamin Delpy, for example, explained a bunch of attacks on the Microsoft Kerberos protocol. And today we're almost 10 years later, and a lot of these techniques are still valid. They still work. I mean, maybe we need to adapt now and there some parts of it, or we need to bypass some security measurements that have been taken, but they still valid. They're still working, and we're 10 years later. Right? That means something. It means that Active Directory, although with its updates, is of course changing and getting it better, but still old stuff like NTLM is still present. Although we've seen a recent evolution from Microsoft that they also want to tackle that problem, so that's a good and a positive evolution. But new content on Active Directory is still being posted on a daily basis. There's a famous website, for example, adsecurity.org, where you can see new types of attacks on Active Directory, weekly or maybe daily basis, where stuff is being posted on how you can attack or how you can abuse certain configurations. For example, this latest one is how to attack managed service accounts in Active Directory. Even though, of course, that's a positive approach of moving in that direction for managing your service accounts, there's always a way of attacking it. We see other tools like Bloodhound, a famous tool to sort of scan your Active Directory environment, and it brings up a map, as you can see on the left, of all the entities, so users, systems, groups that are in your directory and what the relationship is between them. Bloodhound is made to actually discover any unintended relationship between different components and finding the right path or the fastest path to, for example, domain admin and obtaining higher privileges. And then Microsoft brought us Azure AD, or now Entra ID. They they asked us to move all our identities and users into the cloud. That was solving all our problems on-prem. Well, that didn't really happen. We'll see in a second. But this type of move, let's say, to cloud brought also new protocols like OAuth, OIDC, SAML, an extension to the protocols that we had on-prem, which were Kerberos and TLM, LDAP. So instead of moving the problem, let's say, and fixing it with a new solution, we actually extended, let's say, the options or the capabilities from an adversary perspective. And that's also what you see online. The same way that Active Directory is being analyzed and investigated a lot, and this research has been done, which by the way is available for us as blue teamers and analysts, but also for hackers and red teamers, of course. Um, Azure AD has the same way, is analyzed in the same way. You see hacking and admin toolkits like aadinternals.com being releasing blog posts and updates on their toolkit very frequently. Bloodhound has a fork towards what is called Azure Hound, which is purely focusing on Azure AD and doing sort of the same, but now with the concepts in Azure AD like roles and privileges. We see examples of lateral movement where you go from cloud to on-prem because there is a synchronization between them by using privileged service principles in cloud, for example, and allowing listicle send grant for malicious applications by triggering the user of allowing this. So it's another attack path. It's not phishing, but you can deliver it through phishing, but then the user allows an application not really know what he's doing, with all consequences, of course. We see examples on privilege escalation purely in Azure AD, where you go from a simple resource running in your Azure AD environment all the way up to obtaining global admin on the Azure AD tenant by abusing server principals and the rights that they have on different concepts in Azure AD. So these concepts, these new technologies, these new ideas that come up, they also introduce new attack paths. Other examples are Microsoft bringing, for example, single sign-on experience for a Windows client that is only authenticated to the cloud, but you want single sign-on experience on-prem. That's great. They introduced Kerberos server keys, but it actually introduced a new attack path. Azure AD Kerberos, an extension of the Kerberos protocol to Azure AD. We know pass the ticket and silver ticket attacks on-prem, while this brought pass the ticket and silver iodide to Azure AD Kerberos. Same approach, a bit different, but new attack paths.
So we saw a lot of examples about different type of attacks and especially attack paths. We went from on-prem to hybrid to pure cloud. Everywhere there's an attack vector, and that's what the APTs are trying to use. But we can use the same level of defenses we use on-prem actually for a cloud with the same ID behind it. If you look at this picture now, we can see that, okay, the initial access with those valid accounts, that's something very difficult to make sure it doesn't happen, because people are still gonna reuse their passwords. With passwordless, that can help, but still there are other ways, like Davey mentioned, with the session token or still phishing for accounts. But it's all about, first of all, creating awareness for your users. I think that's very important, but also having the right policies and tools in place. If you look at what APTs are going to use, and based on the MITRE ATT&CK framework, we can see we can have some tools in place to see that, okay, when is a account created? Is the account, it was a normal user, now has admin rights or specific rights for SQL servers. So it's about monitoring all those account activity and then see what happens with it in combination with everything about authentication.
So a few examples of what APTs are doing with this, and Sten already mentioned it, is, for example, initial access brokers. What they do is they do the hard work. They breach environments and then they sell the access online. And of course, that's difficult to defend against, because then they sell it to another APT group. And here you can see examples on the dark web where they sell, for example, RDP access with domain access, domain admin credentials or capabilities only for $1,000, or they sell it for $10,000 and they have VPN and RDP access, right? Even with backups of any user password that was in the environment. So it makes it hard for defender, of course, to defend against these kind of attacks, because you have a long dwell time, because of the fact that it gets sold and it takes time for it gets sold to the highest bidder. It's also different APT groups, so they use maybe different techniques and tactics and techniques in order to achieve their goal. And you also need to assume or start from an assumed breach position. For example, Lapsus is one of the famous ones doing a lot of identity-based attacks. They started somewhere, or they have been detected somewhere for the first time in 2021, where they, if I'm not mistaken, breached the Brazilian government, or at least something in that direction. And later on, they were also identified for breaching tech giants like NVIDIA, Okta, and others. They are using a diversity of techniques, because what they do is not really only for the money and extortion, but what they do this also just for fun and for fame. That makes it difficult to detect them. They're not into like the quick wins and targeting a lot of companies and see where they can get in with the same technique. No, they're just having fun, and they want to destroy stuff because they like it. And that for that they use different type of techniques. They don't use any specific malware, and so no clear IOCs can be used in order to detect them, which make it more difficult, of course. What they do is a lot of stuff is specifically on identity security or identity-based attacks, like phishing, dumping credentials wherever they can, bypassing MFA using simple MFA bombing techniques. What they also done, for example, to Okta. Now, the way you can defend against them is, and we'll refer back to the zero trust maturity model, is looking at that least privilege. We need to start from an insider threat perspective. Right? Assume that initial access broker have sold access to your company and start from that position. What can you do with a breached account? How can you secure against it? Are you validating the authentications? Stuff that we've been talking about. Another example is APT42. APT42 is different. They are in the surveillance category, let's say. So they do a lot of stealthy operations to target and monitor individuals, what they are doing by installing malware on their Android mobiles devices. They compromise email accounts, they install backdoors, they do credential harvesting, etc. So they do use malware, but they try to stay under the radar. They are a very complex APT group. They have been analyzed by Mandiant last year. There's a Mandiant report on this, or a blog post, where you can actually see what they're doing. They're nation state sponsored, so it's also difficult to detect what they're doing. But a lot of stuff that they're doing is also identity focused, because of course they need access to these different systems and they want to keep an eye on what the user is doing and getting as much information as possible on their activities. Now, what kind of tools do these adversaries have? Well, a bunch to start with. There's a lot of stuff on the dark web. There are some open source tools as well that are made for blue teamers and red teamers and pen testers, but of course also attackers use this kind of stuff. For example, the Redline malware tool is being seen more and more on the dark web. Raccoon as well, we steal you deal. They basically get all kinds of credentials from credential stores, from your browser, credit cards that you have stored in your browser. Whenever you're doing buying something on online and your browser is asking you want to save the credit card, well, that's the stuff that they're getting out. Same for passwords that have been stored on, for example, Discord or VPN credentials that are stored on disk. This is the kind of stuff that this malware is all about. We see tools that allow session hijacking. We talked about it in the beginning. For example, even Nginx is one of those. It's a very complex or very sophisticated tool, let's say, but it's easy to set it up in the sense that it will, when you try to use it, when you want to use it to bypass authentication and actually get that session token, it gives you the capability of just proxying a website, and the user will just log into it and it will send it to the legit website, so nothing specifically is going on. In the end, the user gets the website, the original one that he's logging into, so he can continue his work, but actually there's a man in the middle, and you have, as an attacker, just now stolen the session token of this user and can also log in under his identity. Another example is code execution. Famous tool there is SharpRDP, also on the dark web. As you can see here, it's being used in Cobalt Strike, and it can be used for code execution through the remote desktop protocol. For example, here they deploy a beacon on another system, and it's a headless communication, so it means you don't get that RDP session, of course, but you just leverage the protocol to execute commands on another system. In this case, a Cobalt Strike beacon is dropped on the system to RDP, and you will see that the attacker will now get control over that machine because it's sending out its command and control channel through that system.
So we see a lot of these examples, okay, but what's next? How can we actually protect ourselves against these type of attacks? And we mentioned it before, right? Getting good policies in place about monitoring what you have to do about identity-based attacks, and that's the whole idea. Let's look at ITDR because there's a lot of facets inside ITDR.
So we try to map the current technology that we see in the ITDR space in a sort of, well, now 11 categories, and we'll probably get more later on. But this is what we see now in the market. Next to everything that is, EDR, NDR, the XDR world, the SIMs, even the IAM infrastructure. But ITDR technology, BC or identity security in general, is focusing on best practices and hygiene of your Active Directory and Azure AD, looking at service accounts through PAM, privileged access management, but also service account protection, enforcing policies, dynamic MFA or MFA everywhere, and also deception technology. So that's sort of like a summary. There are more on this, but there's a summary of what we see in the market. And we want to show you two examples of technology that we believe are already far into the game and know what direction they're going to, have a nice, decent security approach towards identity. And we're gonna let the guide us. We're gonna let Kevin Mannion, guide us through the keynote that he gave on the RSA conference in May this year to introduce us to these two concepts. So let's start off with the first one.
You have to turn on your module logging. You have to study this. You have to get your security operations folks to get visibility into your PowerShell use, your Active Directory, or if you're not using Active Directory in your LDAP or something else, you got to watch all identity use, period. So that's number 1 on this slide, and to some extent, that's number 5 on this slide. Get great at those.
So I hope that audio came through. What he basically describes is full visibility of what's going on and make sure you have a good hygiene on your identity infrastructure. Now, if we're looking at Active Directory, for example, that means having best practices, a good assessment, and a continuous assessment on Active Directory and Azure AD. That's what SentinelOne is doing. So they have this assessment on Active Directory called Ranger AD, and they also introduce active identity protection and deception technology, where they basically try to lure the attacker in presenting fake information from the endpoint perspective, which we assume has been breached, and showing fake information. For example, hiding the real domain controls and show you a bunch of fake domain controls. So the attacker is trying to target something that doesn't exist, and that's a way of winning time. That's also a way of trying to, or a way of detecting that a certain attack is going on, because a normal user would not be targeting or reaching out to these fake servers. Their assessment is something that you can run on a weekly or a daily basis. Whenever some IT administrator or makes a change to Active Directory, that you notice that it's there, that something has changed in your AD environment, that a new attack path has arisen. And of course, you want to know this, and you don't want to know this 6 months after it happened, but you want to know it as fast as possible. So you can remediate it before someone is getting an environment and trying to abuse that attack path. Second example.
I get the question all the time. I'll point this out. Biggest bang for the buck against ransomware, biggest bang for the buck against any impactful attack is multi-factor authentication, period. And figuring out a way to get it everywhere and know that you have it everywhere with some sort of validation is critical.
So here we're talking about MFA everywhere. Now, this is what Silverford is all about. Silverford extends modern identity security controls, like MFA, for example, to any system that you couldn't protect before, and that can be legacy systems, your CLI interfaces, but even service accounts. So what they do is also part of hygiene and assessment of, for example, detecting any account that in your environment that is a domain admin, so showing that the new domain admin has been seen, for example, but also shadow admins with ACLs that have been applied. Now, their main focus is on enforcing those identity security policies. And one of the actions you can do there is, for example, MFA. So whenever a user is trying to access a resource on a per access request, you can apply additional MFA even though single sign-on is in place. So looking at their ITDR approach, they're really monitoring all the activities, user authentications taking place in Azure Active Directory. Okta, for example, as IAM, they support quite a bunch of IAM infrastructures, which they use to actually see every authentication which is going on. And it goes through a detection and response layer where they analyze what's going on, doing risk analysis, and depending on the action that you want to take or about the risk that has been seen, you will apply an additional verification or a block. And if the user does not confirm that validation, the access is denied, even though access should be granted based on these roles and previous authentication. They have a specific approach towards service accounts protection, where they don't do password tracing like classic PAMs, but the approach is more on looking at the behavior of these accounts and making sure that they are only used for what they can only be used for what they're built for. That means it's monitoring the way they see the authentications allow them to automatically detect service account or machine-to-machine communication, and then build virtual fences around that so that these accounts cannot be abused by reaching out to other systems, for example, for lateral movement.
If we think about ITDR and after this session, what's very important is indeed it is about the right tools, but also the best practices. We mentioned having MFA everywhere, but make sure that MFA is also rightly configured to make sure there's no possibility of MFA bypassing with phishing tokens and session hijacking. There are tools that can help you with that, like FIDO, for example, can help you to make sure there's no session hijacking possible. But it's also, again, it's about having that total view about everything about authentication and authorization. In that way, we can have a risk assessment, and that should be a continuous risk assessment, and you need tools to do that. Having the right policies in place and ensure it's also validated, those policies, because we want to have a total view, not only about identity, but again with the zero trust maturity model for all different pillars: identity, network, applications, data, etc. What we ask of you guys is now you feel that you need something more than just only the EDR or your SIEM or whatever. You need ITDR force. That's what Peter is feeling here.
Exactly. So start with enabling MFA. MFA everywhere. I hope you already have it on perimeter exposed equipment like VPNs and cloud access, but that's not enough. Start from the assumed breach position and make sure you can enable MFA everywhere, also on internal resources.
But with EDR, you're gonna say, okay, they're not gonna use malware, so your EDR is pointless at this point. Okay, then ITDR comes in and it will give you unlimited power.
If you're not sure or you're a bit confused on where to start with, just come talk to us. You know we're here. You know how to reach us. We can help you out. We have good visibility on technologies that are rising in the market, on what current technologies can do. So just reach out to us. We can help you out, getting you in the right direction on which technology to invest in and how to work towards that zero trust approach.
Indeed, because for every environment, you will need a different approach, but we can help you guide you through that. So thank you for staying with us. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat or just get back to us on another time. All right, thank you.
All right, thank you, everybody. Have a good rest of the day.